Thank you for joining me today to talk about actually two of the most boring aspects of clinical trials, TMF and regulatory. And consulting company, we just do TMF. I have over 15 years of experience. It's actually more like 20, but I think if I say 20, then I sound really old, so then I just push it back to 15. So I've done pretty much everything: regulatory coordinator, CRA, study manager, and then for the past 8 years, I've really been focused on trial master file. I have a specialty in neurology and oncology studies. I work out on the TMF reference model as a subject matter expert, and the Metric Champion Consortium newly formed TMF Metrics. I'm one of the leaders of that initiative. So let's get started. You're probably looking at this picture like, what is that? That has nothing to do with the TMF. So take a very close look at this picture and tell me what you see. Just shout it out. Faces. Yes. What else? One giant face. What else? Anyone see anything different? People? A guy? Anyone see a dog? No, good, because there's no dog in the picture. So this picture for me represents what the TMF is, right? Everyone sees something different about the TMF. Some people see it just as a place to store documents. Some people see it as a true clinical trial management tool. Some people see it as what it is, which is the basis for audits and inspection. But depending on your vantage point, you're going to see the TMF as something different. So keep that in mind, depending on your job function, keep that in mind, and keep that in mind as we talk about this presentation today. So the objective for today is to learn how to ensure that your TMF trifecta is compliant for continued inspection readiness. How many people can say right now that if a regulatory agency were to come in and look at your TMF, that you would not have any findings? No one, right? I mean, it could be a little bit scary, right? Because the regulatory agencies, they can come in at any time and they can look at your documents at any time, right? And in September, I went to the MHRA's very first TMF workshop. And what I learned, I learned a lot of things that day actually, but one of the things I learned is that the MHRA can actually seize your TMF, so they can actually take it. If they take it, I have no idea what they would do with it. And we actually asked, so if you took someone's TMF, what would you do with it? They didn't have an answer for that. But they can seize your TMF, so they can take your TMF from you, stop your clinical trial, if your documents are not compliant, if they're not contemporaneous with your clinical trial. So that's something to keep in mind, is that your TMF has to be contemporaneous with your clinical trial, and it is the basis for inspection, and a regulatory agency can take it from you. They have that right. So what is the TMF trifecta? It's your people, it's your process, and it's your technology. And no offense to metadata, but I put technology last because technology should be the very last thing that you think about when it comes to the TMF. Think about your people and your process first, then you add in your technology. So why is the trifecta important? Because it defines the who, it defines the what, and it defines the how of the TMF. How many people have a TMF champion in your organization? So someone who maybe they may be the TMF business owner, they may be someone within a department that just really loves the TMF, who is always trying to get everyone excited about it, just someone who is that person, the go-to person for the TMF. That's good. That's really good. It's good to have a TMF champion because that person can really rally the troops, if you will, to have everyone be on board with having the TMF in a contemporaneous manner and really think about the TMF as a trial management tool and not a document repository? How many people have at least one TMF SOP or process that they're following? That's good. Okay, that's very good. And then how many people have an eTMF? Okay, that's good. All right. So that's what the trifecta is, right? It's the people, it's the process, and it's the technology. If you don't have a TMF champion, I highly suggest designating someone within your organization. They may not like it initially, but having someone who is the TMF champion who can really say, this is what the TMF should be. This is how we have to file our documents. This is where it should be filed. This is the process that we're going to follow. So as I mentioned earlier, regulations are changing. And I think the biggest regulation change that we've seen over the past 18 months is ICH GCP Release 2. I mean, there are so many changes in Release 2, and we haven't seen a change in 21 years to that regulation. That regulation alone is changing the way that we manage our clinical trials. And what I recently learned, and I don't know if you all know this, but January of 2017, ICH released a white paper on E8 talking about the modernization of clinical trials. So how we're moving from a lot of paper-based systems to technology. And within E8, what they said is that E6 was updated before E8. And it really should have been the reverse. E8 should have been updated first and then E6. But because E6 was updated first and E8 is going to be updated next, E6 is going to go through another revision. We don't know the timeline for that, but they are going to add 4 annexes to E6. So just be ready. We don't know what the 4 annexes are yet. It's going to be something about technology and modernizing clinical trials, GCP, et cetera. But just to know that E6 is going to be updated again. So regulatory agencies have kind of a one-size-fits-all approach to regulations. All regulations apply to all companies regardless of their size. So just because you're a small company, you can't say, well, I didn't know. That's not going to be acceptable, right? Your company, ABC Pharma, is responsible for all of following the same regulations that Pfizer follows, that Johnson & Johnson follows. We're all subject to the same regulations. So it's very important, especially small and mid-sized companies, to understand the regulations and the regulatory environment that we're currently in. So there are 4 major regulations that kind of support or dictate the TMF. Number 1 is ICH GCP E6 Release 2. Just making sure that you guys can see that. It's kind of, the font is kind of small. 21 CFR Part 11, the EMA 15975 2016 regulation, and the EU Regulation 536 2014. The EU is in the process of updating their regulations to be in compliance with ICH GCP. We don't have a date for when those will be finalized, but probably sometime early to 2018. They closed the period for comments in July, so we're expecting sometime in 2018. But it's important to understand what those regulations require in terms of TMF. They're very specific in what they require. 21 CFR Part 11 is also in the process of being updated. The period for comments closed in August, so we're thinking that the new regulation will come out sometime first quarter or second quarter of 2018, so be on the lookout for that. So when we talk about regulation, there's kind of a hierarchy of what should be followed, right? The first is good clinical practice, right? Whether it's an ICH member state or not, we all follow good clinical practice. And that kind of dictates all of our operations in terms of clinical trials. But the reason that this particular image is horizontal and not vertical is because GCP interpretation varies between member states, non-member states. Even within member states, there are different interpretations of GCP, right? So it's very important that as an organization, you have an understanding of GCP, and when you go into different regions, what their requirements are in terms of GCP. Non-member states, they have yet another interpretation of GCP. That's one of the reasons why ICH decided to update E6, and that's one of the reasons why they decided to update E6 before E8, is because there was so much variation in terms of interpretation of GCP. They tried to make it more detailed so that we can all understand and all have a similar interpretation of what they're expecting in terms of GCP. So what does regulation say about the trifecta? So it gave you all of the regulations that support the TMF, but what does it actually say about the TMF trifecta, the people, the process, and the technology? So the people. So ICH and the EU regulations talk about the people who support and manage the TMF. So ICH, they have really defined and said very clearly that the investigators, the sponsors, and other owners of documents are responsible for the TMF. So they are specifically calling all of these people out to say that, hey, Dr. Smith, you collect documents, you're responsible. ABC Pharma, you collect documents, you're responsible. Even XYZ CRO, you collect documents, you're responsible. So we all have a responsibility when it comes to the documentation of a clinical trial. EU takes it a little bit further, and they are more detailed, and they actually say that the TMF should be maintained by the sponsor and investigator. So one thing to note about the EU is that they see the TMF, there are two components to it, what the sponsor CRO has and what the site has, but the EU, those together make up the TMF, which makes sense, right? Because you can't really have one without the other. But in the EU, they see them together, and that's what comprises the TMF. So they say that together, sponsor and investigator, with the relevant documentation to allow effective supervision, so the monitoring and the inspection. They also say that the sponsor shall appoint a named archivist. How many companies have a named archivist? So no one, so you should, because the new EU clinical trial regulation that's going to come out in probably the end of 2018, the beginning of 2019, is going to require companies to archive their documents for 25 years. 25 years is a very long time. So there has to be one person who's in charge of those archived documents. Those archived documents need to be locked and stored, and only the named archivist can have access to those documents. So it's a lot, I know, because some of you are looking at me like, oh my goodness, I didn't know that. It's a long time to store documents, and it's important to have someone who's in charge of that. So process. So when it comes to document collection, document creation, document filing, it sounds pretty simple, right? I mean, when you think about it, we get a document from the site, we collect it, we scan it, we upload it, apply some metadata, whatever. If it's paper, we collect it, we file it, we're good. We don't have to apply any metadata because there is no for paper. But ICH and the EU regulations are specifying what we need to do in terms of documentation. Now, with ICH GCP Release 2, they have defined a certified copy. So we can no longer, for certain documents, we can no longer just collect, scan, file. There has to be a process to certify that that document that we had as the original and the copy is a certified copy of the original. So we have to have a documented process for that. And it's not every document. So I don't want you all to think that every single document has to be certified, because it's not. The TMF location log. So the sponsor and the sites should maintain a record of the locations of their essential documents, including source documents. How many people have your documents in multiple places? How many people, if they're in multiple places, do you have that documented? So I have contracts in here, yes, that's good, because now that's what ICH is requiring. If you have documents in multiple places, it has to be documented. You have to have a log of that. And ICH and EU regulation tell us that the TMF has to be contemporaneous with your clinical trial. So if you've had first subject, first visit on your study, then all of the documents up to that point need to be filed in the TMF. If you have had a protocol amendment, all of the documents associated with that protocol amendment need to be filed in the TMF. So it's very important that your TMF matches what's happening on your clinical trial. Technology. Of course, again, technology is last, no offense to Medidata. But ICH GCP Release 2 talks about technology in quite some detail. 21 CFR Part 11, the EU regulations talk about it as well. So I'm not going to read this all to you, but to note that if you have an eTMF, it has to be a validated system. So if you're using SharePoint just off the shelf, that's not validated. You cannot say that SharePoint is your TMF, because it's not. It's not validated. You have to have a way of decommissioning the system after the trial has ended. And you have to do all of this for two important reasons. One is that we have to confirm that human subjects have been protected. And then number two, the reliability of your trial results. And I don't know if any of you, if you ever have trouble sleeping at night, you can read ICH GCP Release 2. It's very boring, but the consistent theme with the Release 2 is that the reliability of the results and the protection of human subjects. So it's constantly throughout the update are those two themes. So 21 CFR Part 11 goes into more detail about the expectations when it comes to eTMF. So again, 21 CFR Part 11 is being updated. So I think we can expect more specificity when it comes to what FDA is requiring in terms of validation and archive. But just in general, there are 5 points here that I don't think are going to change with the new update. These are kind of basic. So system functionality. So we talk about audit trails. And at the MHRA TMF workshop, we talked a lot about audit trails. And one thing that Andy Fisher, who is a GCP inspector, has anyone ever heard of him or ever been inspected by him? Okay, he's really tough. So just if you ever see his name on an inspection, then you know. So audit trails are increasingly important, right? Because they tell us what happened throughout the life of a particular document. And one thing that they talked a lot about during the MHRA TMF workshop is when documents are archived. So let's say you have your eTMF system, and let's say your CRO is managing your TMF, and they use an eTMF system. At the end of the study, they put everything onto a flash drive and they give it to you. Does that flash drive contain all of the audit trails from all of the documents throughout the life of the study? They should, and you have to collect it now. That's what ICH tells us. That's what 21 CFR Part 11 is telling us, that you have to have that audit trail with that document, so it's very important. Security of your system, password, username, the correct people need to have the correct access. If you're a CRO not giving access to ABC Pharma's TMF to XYZ Pharma TMF, I mean, I don't know if any of you have ever experienced that, but that's a little bit scary. We're talking about file import, the intended use for the system, vendor audits. So it's very important that if you have an eTMF system to audit your vendor, and this is all part of vendor oversight, which again is talked a lot about in ICH GCP Release 2. Make sure that your technology vendor has SOPs and disaster recovery and backups and validations and all that good stuff. And then again, validation, training for all required users. So the training for a super user shouldn't be the same as the training for a viewer, making sure that the specific roles have the training that applies to their specific role. Okay, so some best practices. So it's a lot of information, it's a lot of regulations, a lot of things are going to happen over the next 18 months in terms of regulation. So how can you keep up with all of the changes? My recommendation, and this is how we personally keep up at LMK, number one is DIA, becoming a member and being in the working group. And I don't mean TMF reference model, I mean the actual DIA. The DIA, because they have a direct ear to, well, in the US, they have a direct ear to the regulators. FDA often presents, I was just at, I'm in the GCP community, and 2 weeks ago, we heard directly from an FDA statistician on changes to GCP. So it's really good. It's a great way to hear directly from the regulatory agencies and what their interpretations are of GCP and what they have going on in terms of work practices, et cetera. So that's a great way to stay in touch with what's happening. Receive alerts directly from regulatory agencies. How many people are subscribed to the MHRA's blog? It's a good, right? The latest blog is on the EU and FDA audit or inspections that are the same in manufacturing. So basically what's happening is if the FDA has an inspection in a manufacturing facility, the MHRA will accept the FDA's findings and vice versa. So that's in manufacturing. Could that happen in GCP? Yes, I think so. Eventually, yes. So receive direct alerts from them. How many people receive direct alerts from the FDA? Oh, that's good. It's good information. You can see the warning letters that have come out. You can see new updates that have come out, personnel changes. It's a great way to stay in touch. Review inspection findings. That's a lot of work, but has anyone seen the MHRA GCP inspection findings? They usually come out once a year. It's a great summary of how many GCP inspections they've had and what the findings were. And they get pretty detailed without obviously giving company names, but they give pretty detailed about what the findings are. So it's a good way to stay in touch with what not to do, if you will. So review their inspection findings. And you can receive alerts for when they come out. They come out every year, usually around July timeframe. Share information with colleagues. So if you have a TMF champion who's staying up to date with all of these different things that are happening, cascading that information to your colleagues, because a lot of times people are, kind of focused on what they're doing and they don't really have an understanding of what's happening with MHRA or FDA updates, et cetera. So sharing that information with them, because that helps to improve compliance when it comes to the TMF. And then ask questions. If you don't know, ask. The DIA has great forums. Sometimes in rare situations, you can ask the regulatory agencies questions. I know the FDA, they go to SOCRA, they go to ACERT, so they're there, they have tables, booths, et cetera. You could ask them questions directly. This is just a list of the updated regulations for 2018 and beyond. Again, we don't really have the dates for most of these. I said 21 CFR Part 11 is going to be updated. ICH GCP E6 is going to be updated again with the 4 annexes. ICH E8 is going to be updated. The guideline on GCP compliance in relation to TMF for content management, archiving, audit, and inspection of clinical trials, that's a white paper that was produced by the EU. It's an excellent white paper. It's not final yet, but what the version that's out there right now, it gives so much information, so much detail. A lot of what I put in here today is from that white paper. And then the EU clinical trial regulation, that's going to completely change the way that we run clinical trials, I'm convinced, 2019-ish. So keep that in mind because it's going to change the way that we do things. So just bringing it all together. Your TMF trifecta, in this order: people, process, technology. Understand ICH GCP, It is the basis for everything that we do. Engage all of your correct stakeholders, make sure that they're informed of the different changes with regulations. Stay informed, be, kind of aggressively seek out information, especially now with so many changes to regulations. We haven't seen this in a number of years, this many changes all at one time. So it's important to understand what's happening, because there's no excuses. Small company, large company, CRO, pharma, we all have to abide by the same regulations. And then, of course, get help when needed. If you don't know, ask, because, again, there's no excuses. I mean, we're all subject to the same regulations, so it's important to have the appropriate information. So here's my contact information, and I left 10 minutes for questions because I figured that we would have some. So thank you all so much. I appreciate it. And I will open it up for questions. Yes. That's good.
When you include the subset of regulatory cycle, because there may be updates to CP, some of it's set.
Right.
That have never made it yet.
Mm-hmm.
So how could you
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, and I'm glad that I said something that woke you up. That's a good thing. So, no, I mean, that's a great question, and it's a challenge, right? It's a challenge to always have your TMF up to date, especially when there are events. And the examples that you gave are exactly right. Changes to CV, changes to site personnel, updates from a local IRB. How do you stay up to date with all of that? And my answer to that is communication. I mean, your monitors, obviously, with reduced SDV and all of these things, they won't be able to make it to the site all the time, right? So constantly being in communication with your sites, with all of the stakeholders, the vendors, et cetera. One thing, and I'll make a short little plug for this, but one thing that I think is really going to help in the future is electronic binders or electronic ICFs. So when the sites are able to file their documents in an electronic format, we'll be able to see it, right? Well, for most of it, the things that don't have patient information, we'll be able to see it on our side, right? So it'll be easy for us to see, oh, there was an updated CV, oh, there's an updated 1572, and take that information from the electronic binder and put it into the TMF. Until then, good communication with your sites, always asking targeted questions, because they have other studies, right? And they may not think, oh yeah, Dr. Smith left, or the IRB has a new policy that they're following, or a new board member, et cetera. So asking targeted questions with respect to the documentation that needs to be filed.
I know that with respect to there have been some breaks in there because of the updating to electronic records. So would there be considerations of regulators that, okay, we don't have all this, but we know there's, still a period of transferring to that status. Mm-hmm.
I think it depends on the inspector. We've been in, it feels like an inspection season over the past few months, and there are some regulatory inspectors from the FDA who are a little bit more lenient, and then there are some who are no. Same with the MHRA. There are some who are, okay, you don't have the audit trail, or you didn't collect it, or it's on a spreadsheet, and then there are some who are no. So I think it depends on your inspector. But I think for ICH GCP Release 2, it's been out long enough now, and they've all of the regulatory agencies have made some type of verbalization of, yes, we're following it now, that I think the grace period might be over. Yeah, unfortunately. Unfortunately. Any other questions? No? Okay.
I have a question. So
of course.
You mentioned the requirement to decommission technology
Yes.
What does that look like if you were managing, if you have a system where you're managing multiple eTMFs, some of which are still active, some of which are, now complete? What does that decommissioning look like if the system is still online?
Right,
What does
absolutely.
the status have to be for that?
That's a great question. I think it's technology specific. So there are some technologies that we've worked with that you have, it's kind of an enterprise technology and you have multiple studies. So we take that study, we lock it, which means we cannot add any other documents to that study. Study's over, we're done. But the other studies are still ongoing, so we can still file to those studies, but that one study is now locked, and now we're gonna archive it, however, for 25 years, which, however that looks like. But I think it's very technology specific. But we do have to have a way and a mechanism and a process to stop the filing of for that particular study once it's completed. And completed may mean something different at different companies. It could mean database lock. It could mean CSR. It could mean CSR plus 6 months or whatever the case may be. That's very kind of process driven. But there should be a mechanism and a way to turn the switch off, if you will, for a study in terms of TMF filing. Good question.
And that's very problematic because I think the requirements that they have to be before that, where you could have an audit trail, which is a program, and the regulator comes in, I can't read this.
Right.
Oh, we got an audit trail. Well, they need to be able to read it, but they can always say, I got an audit trail, but they can't read it. So
Yeah.
is that something that's being addressed?
So at the MHRA TMF workshop, and even the next day at the GCP workshop, the audit trails and certified copies were two of the main things that we talked about almost ad nauseum, honestly. And I think because exactly what you're saying, I think that your process should drive your audit trails and how you collect them and how you maintain them and how you make them available to the regulatory agencies, because they do have to somehow be available. Whether that's the MHRA, the EU directly accessing your TMF and they can see the audit trails, or if you have them on a spreadsheet, which actually we found that they don't like that because obviously a spreadsheet can be manipulated, et cetera. But your process should drive how they view the audit trails because they have to see it. And it's dictated by regulation. So, I mean, it's tough, right? Because some things that they require, it's difficult to give them. But we have to. We don't have a choice. Because they have to be able to, put the story together. Our TMF is the story of our clinical trial, et cetera. They have to be able to put the story together. So, I mean, it's tough because it's a requirement. We have to do it. Yeah.
I do have one question. So you mentioned the requirement TMF is contemporaneous with the clinical trial. We hear a lot of questions with respect to metrics, measuring completeness, timeliness, quality. So I was wondering, in your experience for those metrics, what specifically do you look for? Do you want to measure to illustrate those three?
That's a great question. So a lot of what we do at LMK, we base our timeliness, completeness, and quality off of the Metrics Champion Consortium standards. So we've worked really hard to create agnostic metrics to measure those three things. So for example, quality. We're looking at documents that are complete, they have all the signatures, they have the pages, et cetera, et cetera. Timeliness, that of course, and all three things are driven by your process, right? So timeliness, was that document filed in the TMF in a timely manner? What does timely manner mean? What does your SOP or process say about when a document should be filed? So that we're comparing that to what our process says. And then completeness, making sure that we have all of the versions, all of the instances of a document, and that goes back to what you were saying about making sure that all of the documents from an event are present. So we track all of the events throughout the course of a study to make sure that all the documents associated with that event are filed in TMF. So so metrics, they have to be driven by a process, right? So you have to have a process first in order to measure certain things, because you can't measure it if you don't know what you're measuring. So it's a good question.
Does the MCC then establish what,
Like
best
thresholds.
practice would be? So timeliness is like, well, it should be within a week or 2 weeks, or does it not go that far? That's really based on your internal standards.
So internal standards, we make recommendations for what it should be. And we say 35 days, 35 days, because that's plenty of time, depending on, but it's plenty of time to get a document in, get it QC'd, and then get it filed, et cetera. But we do have KPIs that we've established when it comes to TMF quality, TMF health, and different ways to measure those three things. Yeah, good question. Any other questions? Thank you all so much for joining me today. I appreciate it very much.